This is the feared Ach, the 88mm. It is here, in the freezing Ardennes.
Laden! Schnell! Ist geladen, Herr Hauptmann. Feuer bereit! Feuer!
The morning of December 18th, 1944. The bitter winds of the Ardennes had settled into a cruel stillness that December morning. Frost clung to the trees like a silent specter, and the battlefield, both frozen and fog-covered, seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. It was the kind of cold that sank into your bones, making every movement feel like it was happening in slow motion. The morning fog rolled across the ground like a heavy curtain, muffling the usual noise of the conflict and transforming the world into a muted gray blur. The Battle of the Bulge, as it would later be known, was about to enter one of its darkest phases, and the small village of Kringelt in Belgium found itself right in the heart of this brutal counteroffensive. It was here, in the deep cold, where an uneasy calm settled over a German anti-tank crew who were already on edge. This wasn't just another day on the front. This was the final push, a last desperate attempt by the Germans to turn the tide. In a thickly wooded area just outside Kringelt, the crew had taken up position behind one of the most feared weapons of the entire war, the 88mm Pak-43. The 88mm was a beast of a gun, over 16 feet long, its barrel capable of hurling a 22-pound armor-piercing shell nearly 3,000 feet per second, enough to pierce even the thickest tank armor. German gunners had come to trust this weapon not just as an instrument of war, but as a symbol of their tactical superiority. It was a gun that never missed. The men who manned the 88mm had seen it all. They had survived the hell of the Eastern Front, fought off the Soviets at Kursk, and crushed any tank that came within range. Confidence was not a question for them. It was built into the fabric of who they were. This was their domain. Their certainty was as cold and hard as the frozen ground they sat on, and as the sky darkened with winter's grip, they were prepared to unleash that certainty against whatever approached. In charge of this powerful 88mm was Oberfeldwebel Klaus Richter. At 26 years old, Richter was already a seasoned veteran, one of the best the German army had. He was lean, battle-worn, and carried the quiet confidence of a man who had been to hell and back. His military career had begun in the Eastern Front, where he had destroyed 11 Soviet tanks at the infamous Battle of Kursk, a feat that had earned him respect and the trust of his superiors. Richter wasn't just a commander. He was a tactician, a leader, and a man who, in the face of war's chaos, had learned to hold firm. Richter's reputation preceded him. His crew, the men who worked the 88mm day in and day out, had come to trust his every order. They didn't need to speak much. Their movements were precise, choreographed by the deadly rhythm of warfare. Greiter Hans Mahler, the gunner, knew exactly when to adjust the sights, his hands steady as a rock. Hans Schmidt, the loader, could slam an armor-piercing round into the breech with lightning speed, without a word of direction. And then there was Wilhelm Schwartz, the spotter, whose eyes could find the smallest details in the chaos of battle. This crew was a well-oiled machine trained to destroy. For them, the 88mm was more than a weapon. It was their weapon, one that had never failed them. There was no armor that could stand up to it. Not the Soviet T-34, not the British Churchill, and certainly not the American Sherman. The Americans called it the Tommy Cooker, a derisive term, one that referred to how easy it was for a Sherman tank to catch fire when hit by a German shell. The Germans, in turn, were proud of their firepower, their tactics, and the overwhelming sense of superiority that came with the 88mm. But that morning, as the crew huddled around the gun, their breath rising in white clouds against the cold air, Richter felt something stir deep within him. It wasn't fear, no, he had seen too much to fear anymore. But it was a feeling that he couldn't quite place. A strange sense of anticipation that tugged at him, like something was about to happen that would change everything. The 88mm crew had been awake since 3 a.m., moving swiftly and quietly, setting up in preparation for the expected Allied reinforcements that would come through the Kringlet sector. The fog clung to the earth like a shroud, and in the eerie silence, every distant sound seemed amplified. A footstep on snow, the rustle of a tree branch, the distant thrum of an engine. And then, through the mist, there it was. A shape, a silhouette. Richter's hand went instinctively to the radio, his eyes narrowing as he focused. 300 meters down the road, through the dense fog, a Sherman tank was slowly emerging from the tree line. The crew fell silent. Richter's gaze never wavered, watching as the American tank trundled forward, its turret moving slowly, scanning for threats. To the crew, this was nothing out of the ordinary. A Sherman. They had fought many of them. The plan was simple. Take the shot, hit the target, destroy the tank. The 88mm was the finest anti-tank weapon in the world, and in Richter's mind, nothing had ever withstood its might. The crew shifted into action. Muller, the gunner, immediately began rotating the barrel of the 88mm, preparing for the shot. He adjusted his sights to zero in on the Sherman's vulnerable hull just below the turret ring, an area where the armor was thinner. "Ready," Richter commanded. His voice was calm, a quiet confidence echoing through the cold air. The gun was locked on target. The crew moved in harmony, their bodies moving with the precision of well-trained soldiers. This was their moment, the moment when their skill and weaponry would prove themselves once more. Richter's voice cut through the silence, the order clear and authoritative. "Fire!" The 88mm roared to life, the sound of it filling the air like thunder. Richter felt the shock wave reverberate through his body, a powerful force that rattled his teeth. The shell flew forward, cutting through the morning mist with deadly precision. But then something happened. The shell hit the Sherman's hull, but instead of the expected explosion, there was a flash of sparks, and the round ricocheted off the armor, soaring high into the gray sky. For a moment, no one spoke. The crew stared, wide-eyed. Muller blinked, unsure of what had just happened. Had he misjudged the range, the angle, the impact? Richter's mind raced. The 88mm had never failed them before. Never. He scanned the crew's faces. Shock, confusion. The Sherman kept moving forward, seemingly unaffected. "Another round," Richter ordered, his voice a little sharper now. He was confused, but he wouldn't let his crew see it. This was just a fluke, he told himself. The next shot would work. It had to. Want to know what happens next? How could the Jumbo Sherman deflect 2 direct hits from the infamous 88mm Pak-43? Stay tuned and hit the subscribe button to follow this extraordinary story through its unexpected twists. For 3 long years, the 88mm Pak-43 had been the defining weapon of the German Wehrmacht, a silent, relentless force that turned the tides of battle in their favor time and time again. It wasn't just a gun. It was a philosophy in steel, a physical embodiment of the German approach to warfare, a philosophy that the 88mm was unbeatable. The 88mm had been developed in the early 1930s as an anti-aircraft gun, designed to shoot down enemy bombers with incredible precision and power. But in the chaos of the Spanish Civil War, German gunners quickly discovered something extraordinary. They realized that the 88mm could also tear through enemy tanks with ease. It was a game changer. During the early days of the Second World War, the 88mm became synonymous with the German army's dominance on the battlefield. By the time the Germans invaded France in 1940, the 88mm had already proven itself as the king of anti-tank warfare. It could penetrate the armor of nearly every Allied tank, from the British Churchill to the French Char B-1. Its reputation was built on the foundation of its immense firepower and unparalleled accuracy. No tank, no matter how heavily armored, was safe from its reach. For Oberfeldwebel Klaus Richter and his crew, the 88mm was an extension of themselves. It had been their constant companion through countless battles, each engagement sharpening their skills and reinforcing their belief in its power. The crew had become a tightly knit unit, their coordination and precision honed through endless practice. Every movement, every action was automatic. There was no need for words. They communicated through years of experience and instinct. Richter was particularly proud of his men. He knew that their success wasn't just about the weapon. It was about their ability to make it sing. They had fought through the hell of the Eastern Front, where the stakes were higher than ever. The cold, the endless miles of barren land, the constant threat of Soviet tanks. It had forged them into one of the most capable anti-tank crews in the Wehrmacht. And their weapon, the 88mm, had never failed them. The gunner, Greiter Hans Müller, was as steady as the earth itself. He had been with Richter from the very beginning and was widely regarded as one of the best in the business. His focus was unmatched. Hans Schmidt, the loader, was quick and efficient, always knowing exactly when and where to load the next round. And Wilhelm Schwartz, the spotter, could pick out a target in the fog of war with a precision that bordered on supernatural. When the crew set up their 88mm, there was an unspoken certainty that their target, whether a Soviet T-34, a British Churchill, or an American Sherman, would be destroyed. They had seen it happen over and over again. The 88mm was invincible, and with it, they were too. As the 88mm took its place on the field of battle, Richter and his crew felt the same sense of confidence they always did. They knew that once the 88mm fired, it would rip through anything in its path. The psychological power of the 88mm was almost as important as its physical one. For the German army, it was more than just a weapon. It was a symbol of their superiority. The doctrine surrounding the 88mm was clear. When positioned correctly, it could halt entire Allied advances. German tankers and infantry feared it, and Allied forces were often forced to change their tactics just to avoid it. The presence of an 88mm gun could turn the tide of an entire battle. Richter's crew understood this better than anyone. They had seen it in action countless times. In Normandy, where the 88mm had torn through the ranks of the American Shermans, they had learned to trust in its infallibility. They had no reason to believe that anything could survive its devastating fire. But that confidence would soon be tested in a way Richter could never have imagined. Despite their unwavering belief in the 88mm, there was a cold, harsh reality to the war they were fighting. The German army was fighting a war on two fronts, stretched thin and facing increasingly overwhelming odds. By late 1944, Germany's position in the war had grown more desperate. The once unstoppable blitzkrieg had faltered, and the Allies had pushed them back on all sides. Richter knew that the Germans couldn't keep up with the technological advances of the Allies. While the 88mm remained their best weapon, they were struggling to adapt. The Americans were producing tanks faster than Germany could produce ammunition for the 88mm. The Sherman tank, for all its flaws, was ubiquitous. And in many ways, it had already started to change the nature of tank warfare. Richter had no way of knowing it, but the war was reaching a point where his beloved 88mm would meet its match. That match was the M4A3E2 Jumbo Sherman, a tank that would rewrite the rules of the battlefield and shatter the sense of invincibility his crew had built over years of combat. But for now, Richter and his men had no idea what was coming. The German crew was ready. The 88mm Pak 43 stood firm, its long barrel aimed down the frozen forest road, every crew member a well-practiced part of a deadly machine. The early morning fog still lingered like a ghost, blanketing the battlefield and giving the scene a surreal quality. Through the mist, Richter's sharp eyes spotted movement. A shadow, a silhouette. At first, it was nothing more than a faint outline, barely perceptible in the haze. But then the shape became clearer. The tank. Richter's pulse quickened. This wasn't just any tank. This was a Sherman, an American Sherman. But it was no ordinary Sherman. It was a M4A3E2, the Jumbo. Richter had no idea. He could only see the tank's silhouette, its turret moving slowly as if scanning for threats. For all he knew, it was a standard Sherman, just another enemy target to destroy. He had destroyed countless Shermans in the past. It was routine aim, fire, kill. But there was something different about this encounter, something Richter couldn't yet put his finger on. His trained eyes locked onto the target. It was about 300 meters away. The distance was perfect. The crew had trained for this moment. They knew it well. Every shot they took was a calculated strike, every movement rehearsed in the heat of battle. They had done this so many times it was second nature. Range, 300 meters. Ready to fire. Mellor, the gunner, said flatly, his eyes focused through the sighting scope. Richter's voice was steady. Fire. The 88 millimeters roared to life. Richter felt the shockwave as the cannon fired, the ground beneath him trembling from the blast. The shell shot forward, a streak of steel and destruction. Cut through the fog and air, a deadly force traveling with devastating speed. Seconds later, the explosion of the shell's impact echoed across the field. But it wasn't the sound Richter was used to hearing. There was no fiery explosion, no satisfying destruction. No Sherman turned to scrap. Instead, there was a flash of light, a spray of sparks, and then nothing. The shell ricocheted off the Sherman's armor, rising into the sky and disappearing into the gray, mist-filled heavens. For a moment, there was only stunned silence. Richter stared, his mind struggling to make sense of what had just happened. His 88 millimeters had never failed him, not once in 3 years. It had torn through everything in its path, Soviet tanks, British armor, and countless Allied vehicles. But now, here in the frigid morning, it had failed to penetrate the Sherman's hull. Muller, the gunner, was still peering through the optics. His hand tightened around the controls, trying to understand what had gone wrong. He blinked and quickly recalculated. Had he misjudged the range? Was the angle off? But everything looked perfect. The shot should have been textbook. The Sherman, that Tommy Cooker, as the Germans called it, didn't even slow down. It kept moving, inching closer, as if the shell had been nothing more than a bothersome fly. Richter turned to his loader. Another round now. His voice was tight with disbelief, but his hands were calm. This was not the moment to show weakness. The 88 millimeters had failed, but they would correct it. One more shot, he told himself. The crew quickly reloaded. Schmidt, the loader, worked with mechanical precision. The shell was loaded into the breech with a loud clang, and Muller was already adjusting the sights, his face grim. Ready, Muller said, his voice low but steady. Richter's command was firm, unwavering. Fire! The 88 millimeters blasted again, sending the second shell toward the Sherman. Richter's heart pounded as the explosion shook the ground beneath him. This time, the crew watched with absolute focus as the shell struck its target, dead center on the Sherman's hull. And again, the impossible happened. Sparks flew. The shell bounced, deflecting off the thick steel like a stone skipping across water. The Sherman kept advancing. This time, the silence that followed was deeper, more profound. Richter stood still, his mind in overdrive. He couldn't believe it. The 88 millimeters had torn through everything it had faced. No tank, no matter how well armored, could withstand its force. But here, against the Sherman, it had failed twice. The crew exchanged glances, but no one spoke. They had never encountered anything like this. The first shot was an anomaly, they had told themselves. But the second? That was different. This wasn't just bad luck or a miscalculation. The Sherman had withstood the 88 mm's power. Richter swallowed hard. "Again," he ordered. His voice now tinged with a rare crack of uncertainty. The loader scrambled, his hands moving automatically as his mind raced. They had trained for this. They had destroyed everything in their path. But this Sherman, this impossible Sherman, was not reacting the way it should. What Richter and his crew did not know, what they could not have known, was that they were not facing just any Sherman. This was the M4A3E2 Jumbo Sherman, a rare variant of the standard Sherman, built specifically to survive in the harshest of conditions. It was not like the regular Sherman, which had 2 to 4 inches of armor on its hull and turret. No, the Jumbo had been designed with nearly 7 inches of hardened steel on its frontal armor. The glassy plate alone was thicker than anything the 88 mm had been designed to pierce. The Jumbo had been conceived as a heavy assault tank, a vehicle capable of leading infantry assaults while withstanding the most punishing fire. The design had been rushed into production in 1944, when the Allies realized that their existing tanks were vulnerable to German anti-tank weapons, especially the deadly 88 mm. Only 254 of these tanks were built, and because of their rarity, German intelligence had never caught wind of their existence. The Jumbo was kept a secret, and the Germans were unprepared to face it. The 88 mm gun, the very weapon that had defined their armor dominance, had just met its match. It wasn't just the tank itself that was so shocking, it was the psychological impact. The Germans had spent years perfecting their doctrine and weaponry. The 88 mm was a symbol of their superiority, and it had always worked. But now, faced with the Jumbo, it was clear that their doctrine was outdated. Their confidence was eroding. The American Jumbo had survived 2 direct hits from the most powerful anti-tank gun in the world, and it was still advancing. The German gunners, once so certain of their ability to destroy any enemy tank, now found themselves questioning everything they knew about tank warfare. Richter's crew had never experienced anything like this. For the first time, they were unsure. Was their weapon faulty? Was the Sherman a freak of engineering? Or was it something else entirely? A new weapon that they simply could not defeat? The fog of war had a way of concealing more than just the enemy. It concealed truths that even the most seasoned soldiers could not see coming. On the battlefield outside Kringelt, the German crew, having watched their most trusted weapon fail them, couldn't have known they were facing a Sherman tank unlike any they had encountered before. This wasn't a mere tank. It was a revelation in steel. What Richter and his crew failed to realize as they struggled with the failure of their 88 mm was that they had just met a game-changer. The M4A3E2 Jumbo Sherman, a rare variant of the Sherman, had emerged from the depths of wartime necessity. It was built not out of idealistic planning but out of desperation, born from the Allies' growing realization that their tanks needed more than just firepower. They needed armor capable of withstanding the unrelenting firepower of the Germans. Unlike the regular Sherman with its standard 2 to 4 inches of armor, the Jumbo Sherman was a heavy assault tank designed to take the most brutal punishment and still keep moving. Its armor, reinforced with up to 7 inches of hardened steel in key areas, was a direct answer to the 88 mm's penetrative power. In the chaos of the battlefield, the Germans had never seen such a tank. Richter's crew, experts in gauging the effectiveness of armor, had expected their 88 mm to do what it had done countless times before, to tear through the target's armor like paper. But the Jumbo defied their understanding of what was possible. They didn't know it yet, but their 88 mm, the weapon that had brought down so many formidable tanks, had met its match. The origins of the M4A3E2 were rooted in practical necessity, not innovation for innovation's sake. In the spring of 1944, as the Allies prepared for the D-Day invasion, planners realized that their tanks, while reliable, were vulnerable to the increasingly powerful German anti-tank guns, especially the 88mm Pak-43. The invasion of Normandy was imminent, and the need for a tank that could take the blows from the German defensive lines became clear. The solution was simple: reinforce the Sherman with as much armor as possible. The engineers in the U.S. Army's Ordnance Department went to work with urgency. They chose the M4A3 chassis as the base, a model already in full production. The design was straightforward. Add as much steel as the suspension could handle without compromising the tank's ability to move at all. In a matter of months, the design had been completed. The glassy plate, the tank's front armor, was reinforced with an additional 1.5 inches of face-hardened steel, bringing the total thickness to around 5.5 inches at a 47 degrees angle. This upgrade, when combined with the natural angle of the glacis, effectively increased the tank's effective thickness to 7 inches of protection against direct fire. Even the turret received dramatic reinforcement. The frontal turret armor was increased to a solid 7 inches, and the gun mantlet, where the weapon was housed, was thickened to nearly 8 inches. The side armor, typically thin and vulnerable on standard Shermans, was strengthened to 3 inches, and even the tracks were given additional protective skirts to shield the suspension from explosive anti-tank rounds. The result was a tank that weighed approximately 42 tons, up from the standard 33 tons. This added weight, while reducing mobility and speed, gave the Jumbo Sherman its remarkable durability. It could take a direct hit from an 88mm round and keep going, something no other tank in the Allied arsenal could do. The M4A3E2 was created out of urgency and necessity, but it was also shrouded in secrecy. Only 254 of these tanks were ever produced, making them a rare breed. And because of their limited production, German intelligence was caught completely off guard. The American military kept the Jumbo Sherman's existence tightly under wraps. German intelligence was focused on the numbers. They knew the Allies were producing tanks in vast quantities, but they were not aware of this new variant. In a war defined by overwhelming technological advances, a tank with such heavy armor was a complete shock. Richter and his crew had never heard of the M4A3E2 Jumbo. They knew the standard Sherman and had a well-documented understanding of its weaknesses. They had grown accustomed to dealing with it as a rolling coffin, a tank that was too easy to destroy with their 88mm's firepower. But the Jumbo wasn't just another Sherman. It was a formidable beast with armor designed specifically to withstand the most punishing German anti-tank weapons. The surprise factor played a crucial role in the Jumbo's effectiveness. When the 88mm failed to penetrate the Sherman's armor, it wasn't just a tactical setback for the Germans. It was a psychological blow. This was a weapon the Germans had relied on for years, a weapon that had never failed them in battle, now rendered impotent against a tank that, in their minds, should have been vulnerable. As the Sherman continued to advance through the mist, Richter's mind raced. The confidence that had once been solid as steel was now cracked, and the sense of invincibility that had defined the crew for so long seemed like a distant memory. How could this be happening? Richter thought. The 88mm had always worked. It had destroyed tanks from the British Churchill to the Soviet T-34. Why was it failing now? His gunner, Muller, kept his sights on the tank. He adjusted for the next shot, but Richter could see the confusion in his eyes. They had trained for this moment for years: aim, fire, destroy. But now they faced something they couldn't explain. "Ready," Muller said again, though his voice lacked the usual certainty. Richter's heart pounded in his chest, but his tone was still firm. "Fire!" The 88mm fired again, but this time Richter's doubt was palpable. The Jumbo Sherman was now a force they could not ignore. With each bounce of the shell, the crew's confidence eroded further. Muller fired the shell, and once more, it hit the target with force, only for it to deflect off the Sherman's armor. The Sherman continued forward, its engine humming steadily, as if it were invulnerable to their fire. The crew had fought countless battles, but this felt different. For the first time, they weren't the ones in control. They weren't the ones who held the power to decide the outcome of the battle. And Richter knew, deep down, that this moment marked the beginning of a shift, a moment that would change the war in ways they hadn't anticipated. The cold, fog-covered battlefield outside Kringelt had become the stage for something greater than just another skirmish in the Battle of the Bulge. It was a turning point, a moment when everything the Germans had believed about their superiority began to unravel. Richter and his crew had faced their first M4A3E2 Jumbo Sherman, and what should have been a routine engagement had shattered their certainty in a way they couldn't yet fully understand. Richter wiped his brow, his hands still gripping the cold metal of the 88mm's controls. The last round had bounced off the Sherman like a stone skimming across water, and that singular moment had created a ripple of confusion that spread throughout the entire crew. They had seen the sparks. They had heard the deflection. The tank should have been destroyed, but it wasn't. It had kept going, and now Richter could feel the weight of doubt pressing down on him. The crew had never questioned their weapon, the 88mm Pak-43. It had been perfect in its design, its firepower unparalleled. But now, Richter's mind raced with thoughts that he didn't want to entertain. What if this wasn't just bad luck? What if their weapon was failing them? What if this Sherman wasn't the same as all the others? In the distance, the Jumbo Sherman continued its slow advance. The fog enveloped the tank, but there was no denying its presence. The 88mm had failed to penetrate its armor, and now Richter found himself at a crossroads. He couldn't ignore the situation. The Sherman wasn't a fluke. It wasn't just another Tommy cooker waiting to explode with a direct hit. It was different. Richter clenched his teeth, unwilling to admit to himself that their old tactics might no longer work. The 88mm was designed to be the final word in tank warfare, yet here they were, facing something their doctrine hadn't prepared them for. Again, Richter barked, the words barely escaping his clenched jaw. We need another round now. But deep down, he knew that the very essence of the German military's approach was being challenged. The 88mm, their pride, had failed twice. And this wasn't just about the tank. This was about the German military strategy, their overwhelming reliance on technology to win. The loader, Schmidt, worked mechanically as always, but Richter could see the uncertainty in his eyes. They were all questioning it now. Muller, the gunner, had fired with perfect precision, but the result had been the same. The Sherman didn't burn up. It didn't crumble into ruins. It simply kept coming. Muller slammed another round into the breech, his face hard, but his hands trembled slightly. Richter glanced at him, catching his eye for the briefest moment. There was a hesitation there that wasn't usually present. Ready? Muller said flatly, his voice carrying a hint of doubt. Richter's heart pounded in his chest. The tension in the air was palpable. The fog seemed to grow thicker as he stared at the advancing Sherman. He could feel his breath catch in his throat, but he pushed it down. He had to remain composed. The 88mm was still the weapon of choice, wasn't it? Fire, he commanded, forcing the words from his lips. The 88mm fired again, the recoil sending a jolt through Richter's body. The ground trembled beneath them, and the shock of the blast rattled the equipment around them. But this time, Richter's focus wasn't on the sound of the shell firing or the force of its impact. His eyes were fixed on the Sherman. They were all watching it. And again, the result was the same. The shell struck the Jumbo Sherman's hull, but it bounced off with another brilliant flash of sparks. This time, Richter saw something else. The Sherman didn't just keep moving, it adjusted. The turret slowly began to rotate toward their position, its gun now aiming directly at them. Richter froze. The psychological weight of this moment hit him like a freight train. The Sherman, the very tank he had assumed would be an easy kill, was now hunting them. The crew didn't speak. They didn't need to. They all felt it. Their weapon, their tactic, their beliefs, they were no longer enough. By the time Richter gave the order for another round, the truth had begun to sink in. The Jumbo Sherman wasn't like other tanks. It was something new, something that defied everything the German crew had learned on the battlefield. They had always believed that once their 88mm hit its mark, victory was assured. But this Sherman, this armored beast, was rewriting the rules. As the Sherman continued to advance, Richter realized that their usual tactics weren't going to work. The 88mm could no longer be relied upon as the definitive weapon. His crew, long accustomed to their superiority, now faced a shift in mindset. They had to adapt or they would die. Richter had trained his men for countless battles, and they had never failed. But now, with the Jumbo in their sights, they were faced with something they had no preparation for. They could no longer trust their superior firepower alone. They would have to be more creative, more cunning, and more daring. The 88mm was no longer the one weapon that could solve all problems. The idea that a tank, an American tank no less, could survive the most powerful anti-tank gun on the battlefield was inconceivable. But it had happened, and it would continue to haunt them unless they adapted. It wasn't just the 88mm that had to adjust. It was the very nature of how they fought. At that moment, as the crew reloaded the 88mm yet again, Richter's mind raced. He was not ready to concede defeat. He would not let this tank be the one that shattered their confidence. But it was clear now. A change in tactics was essential. The Sherman, the Jumbo Sherman, had forced his hand. For the first time in years, the Germans had encountered a tank they could not easily destroy, and the effects of that realization would ripple through the battlefield. What had been a routine encounter for Richter and his men had turned into a harrowing challenge, one that would echo through the ranks of the German military for the remainder of the war. The encounter outside Kringel wasn't just a minor setback. It was a watershed moment that signified the end of the German military's technological dominance. The war had changed, and the Jumbo Sherman was a symbol of that shift. The Germans now had to face a new reality, one where their most trusted weapon might not be enough. Richter couldn't look away from the Jumbo Sherman. Its turret was now fully turned toward them, a cold, mechanical gaze that seemed to taunt the crew. He stood rigid at the 88mm Pak 43, his mind racing for answers, but there were none. His hands felt clammy, the cold seeping into his bones, but it wasn't the weather that had him frozen. It was the realization that they were facing something entirely new, something they had no preparation for. The Jumbo had survived 2 direct hits from the 88mm, shots that should have torn it apart. The first hit had been shocking, the second impossible. Yet, there it was, still advancing, as though it were a living, breathing monster impervious to everything Richter and his crew had known to be true about tank warfare. His eyes flicked to Muller, the gunner, whose hands had slowed with doubt. Muller had fired with perfect precision every time, but his confidence was now faltering. The gunner's usual steady gaze was now clouded with hesitation. Richter's mind worked furiously. This was his crew, his responsibility, and the trust he had in their training was now crumbling under the weight of something no doctrine, no experience, had prepared them for. "Reload. We fire again," Richter barked. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew they wouldn't be enough. The loader, Schmidt, was already at work. His movements were mechanical, but the uncertainty in his eyes mirrored Richter's own. The crew had been through countless engagements, but this one was different. That Sherman wasn't following the script. Richter's mind drifted back to his training days, to the manuals and war plans that had been drilled into him from the beginning. He remembered the specific guidelines. Aim, fire, destroy. That was the law. That was the formula. No tank survived the 88 millimeters. That was the German doctrine, the core belief that had carried them through the early victories of the war. The psychological edge they gained from the absolute confidence in their firepower was undeniable. But now it was all crashing down around them. They had been fighting a war of attrition for so long, and now their most feared weapon, the weapon that had made them the terror of the battlefield, had failed. They hadn't just missed. The 88 millimeters had bounced. It had been deflected, and that wasn't supposed to happen. Richter's chest tightened. How do we deal with something like this? His mind raced for a solution. In war, there was always a solution. But here, with this jumbo in front of them, the solution wasn't clear. For the first time in his life, Richter considered that maybe there was no answer. Maybe this tank, this M4A3E2, was simply a force of nature that they couldn't defeat. Meanwhile, the jumbo kept pushing forward. It wasn't fast, but it didn't need to be. The tank's design was simple but brutally effective. It was the tank the Allies had been dreaming of, able to absorb damage and still keep fighting. And it wasn't just the armor that made it dangerous. It was the presence of it on the battlefield. The Americans, though outnumbered, had learned the hard lesson that firepower alone couldn't win the war. The jumbo embodied that lesson. And while Richter's crew was still fighting to adapt, the Jumbo Sherman was forcing both sides to adjust their plans, whether they liked it or not. In the confusion of the fog and the chaos of the Battle of the Bulge, German command had no idea the jumbo existed in numbers. They had not prepared for this kind of armor. In the rush of information and disinformation that surrounded the final months of the war, the intelligence reports had failed to mention this new threat. The Sherman they had faced for so long, the one they had always considered an easy target, was now more than just a nuisance. It was a game changer, a tactical surprise, and one that the Germans couldn't ignore. As the days passed, the German crew's doubt only deepened. The 88 millimeters had always been the solution. It had never failed. But now, even their best gunners, men like Muller, couldn't bring the jumbo down. The realization gnawed at Richter. They couldn't win this battle with just brute force. There had to be another way. But what? For the first time in months, Richter found himself revisiting the thought he'd pushed aside. What if the enemy had out-engineered them? Richter's mind shifted back to the command structure. They couldn't be the only ones in this situation. Surely, higher-ups would realize that the Jumbo Sherman was a threat. But in the chaos of the Battle of the Bulge, when communication was strained and battlefield reports were coming in fragmented, how could they even send word of what was happening? There were already signs that this battle wasn't like any the Germans had fought before. As Allied forces pressed on, morale was wearing thin. American tankers, emboldened by the jumbo's ability to absorb hits, began to push forward with confidence they hadn't had before. They were not retreating. They were advancing. Richter knew that this would be an uphill battle. The war is no longer about firepower alone, he thought. It's about survival. That evening, as the fog began to lift, Richter found himself staring at the Jumbo Sherman again from a distance. It was no longer just a machine. It had become a symbol, a psychological weight on his crew. Every shot they fired and missed took a toll, eroding their confidence. The 88 millimeters was no longer a solution. It was a problem in itself. Muller and Schmidt didn't say a word. The silence between them spoke volumes. There was no need to discuss it. They all knew the truth now. They were fighting an enemy that refused to follow the rules. The Jumbo Sherman was part of that new reality, a reality that Richter had not yet fully accepted. The world he had once understood was slipping away, and in its place was a terrifying uncertainty. The next few minutes felt like hours. The fog had lifted, but Richter's mind was clouded. As he watched the Jumbo Sherman move further into enemy territory, he finally said something the crew had all been thinking. "We have to change how we fight." The M4A3E2 Jumbo Sherman had forced the German military to come to terms with something they had never anticipated. The Allies had developed a tank that could withstand their most powerful anti-tank guns and still keep fighting. The 88mm, their greatest weapon, had been tested and found wanting against this unexpected threat. And in the fog of the Ardennes, as German gunners began to face the Jumbo more frequently, the reality of their predicament settled in. For the Germans, war had always been a matter of superiority, superior firepower, superior tactics, and superior technology. The 88mm had been the cornerstone of this superiority, capable of destroying nearly every Allied tank in service. But now they were facing a new kind of enemy, one that could take their best shots and keep going. This was not just a setback, it was a seismic shift in how the Germans would need to fight. In high command, the message was clear. The Jumbo could no longer be ignored. The intelligence failure that had allowed this tank to slip under their radar had proven to be catastrophic, and now the Jumbo was spreading across the battlefield. But how could the Germans respond? Back at their command post, the officers had already begun to issue orders for new tactics. Panzer and anti-tank commanders were instructed to alter their strategies when engaging Allied armor. The failure of the 88mm to penetrate the Jumbo Sherman from the front was undeniable. There were no immediate answers to the Jumbo's armored superiority. The 88mm was simply inadequate against it in frontal engagements, especially when the Jumbo's thick armor, reinforced at critical points, could absorb multiple shots without even slowing down. The new doctrine began to emerge: flank attacks, use of multiple anti-tank guns in coordination, and targeting vulnerable points like the sides and rear. It was a shift in tactical thinking, but the reality of the Jumbo Sherman forced these decisions. There were no other options. The Germans were now adapting, but it was too late to change the course of battle in an instant. The first test of this new doctrine came on December 19, 1944, at Bastogne, where the Germans were making their push through the Ardennes. As American forces scrambled to defend key positions, they encountered a new, terrifying presence: the Jumbo Sherman. 3 of these tanks, leading the charge, were the spearhead of the 33rd Armored Regiment. They were tasked with holding a vital crossroads against the advancing German forces. As the Germans pressed forward, their 88mm guns were once again aimed at the incoming Jumbos. But this time, the result was different. A Tiger tank positioned 1,000 meters away took its shot at the lead Jumbo Sherman, a powerful 88mm round. The shell struck the Sherman's glassy plate, and again, the unmistakable flash of sparks erupted. The round deflected, harmlessly glancing off the heavy steel. The Tiger crew, stunned by the resilience of the Jumbo, fired again. This time, the shell hit the turret, the thickest part of the tank. The result was the same. The Jumbo didn't flinch. The tank continued to advance, shrugging off the hits as if it were invincible. For the German forces, watching the Jumbo absorb their fire without so much as a scratch was a profound shock. It was no longer just an anomaly. This tank was reshaping the fight. The tactical advantage that the Germans had enjoyed for years, with their superior anti-tank weaponry, was suddenly in question. The encounter at Bastogne was pivotal, not just tactically, but psychologically. The Germans had faced tanks that were resistant to their firepower before, but none like this. There had always been a clear line between German superiority and Allied inferiority. Now, that line was being blurred, and the psychological toll on German commanders and soldiers was growing heavier with each encounter. The Jumbo Sherman became a symbol, not just of resilience but of an American innovation that they couldn't quite comprehend. As more jumbos engaged German forces in the Battle of the Bulge, the Germans began to see that their past strategies, flanking and ambush tactics, might no longer work in this new paradigm of tank warfare. The failure of the 88mm to penetrate the Jumbo Sherman was more than just a tactical problem. It was a crisis of confidence. The German military had prided itself on technological superiority. But here, in the heart of the Ardennes, that superiority was crumbling. By December 22nd, the shift in German tactics was clear. Commanders now focused on outmaneuvering the Jumbo Sherman rather than engaging it head-on. They sent squads of infantry and anti-tank gunners to try and hit the Jumbo from the sides, where the armor was thinner. They coordinated multiple 88mm anti-tank guns to fire from different angles, hoping that sheer volume of fire could overcome the Sherman's defenses. But the reality of these engagements was stark. Even with a concerted effort, the Jumbo Sherman proved incredibly difficult to neutralize. Its armor, while not invulnerable, was more than enough to withstand the 88mm's punishment from the front and the sides. The Germans were forced into a defensive position, no longer able to rely on their signature offensive tactics. Back at the German 88mm positions, the gunners were feeling the pressure. Each time a Jumbo Sherman appeared, they knew it would be a fight unlike any other. Their confidence in the 88mm was being tested. They no longer had the unquestioned superiority they had once felt. For the first time, the 88mm crews had to admit that their weapon, which had once been the ultimate answer to Allied tanks, was no longer infallible. As the battle dragged on and the Jumbos continued to hold their ground, the gunners found themselves facing an unfamiliar feeling: doubt. Richter, who had once been a commander of unquestioned confidence, now found himself questioning the very weapon he had trusted to lead him to victory. How had it come to this? How had the 88mm, once the king of anti-tank artillery, met its match in a tank that was built quickly on the fly and with little fanfare? It wasn't just the 88mm that was shaken. It was the German military's sense of certainty. The Jumbo Sherman was more than just a tank. It was a symbol of how quick innovation, industrial capability, and adaptation could change the course of battle. By late December 1944, the Germans were in full retreat. Their response to the Jumbo Sherman had been too little, too late. The American tanks had already gained a psychological upper hand, and while the Germans were still formidable in their use of terrain and tactics, their heavy tanks and anti-tank guns were no longer the overwhelming force they once were. Richter and his crew, exhausted and demoralized, began to understand the full scale of their predicament. The battle for Kringelt had turned into something far greater than a simple firefight. The Jumbo Sherman had been a symbol of American ingenuity, and its presence on the battlefield had shifted the balance of power. By late December 1944, the Germans were feeling the weight of a loss they hadn't yet fully understood. As they continued their offensive in the Battle of the Bulge, the psychological impact of the M4A3E2 Jumbo Sherman became undeniable. It wasn't just that the tank was surviving, it was that it was thriving under fire, and in doing so, it was changing everything about the way the Germans fought. Richter, his crew, and countless others in the Wehrmacht had been raised with the understanding that their 88mm Pak 43 was the weapon that dominated the battlefield. It had never failed them before. Tanks fell before it like paper. But now, the one enemy they could not destroy was the very thing that had always been a source of their pride: their superior technology. The Jumbo Sherman had shattered that illusion. No longer was the battlefield a place where victory came easily with a well-placed shot from the 88mm. Instead, every engagement with these tanks felt like a personal failure for the Germans. The strategic loss was far greater than the failure of a single weapon. It signified a crisis of confidence that would plague the Wehrmacht for the remainder of the war. Desperation had begun to set in. German high command, still clinging to the hope of a breakthrough, began issuing new orders. They could no longer rely on their conventional tactics, nor could they wait for reinforcements that were not coming. The Germans knew they were outnumbered and that their production capabilities were dwindling. Every tank they lost was irreplaceable, and now, with the Jumbo Sherman in the fight, each loss was felt even more deeply. In an effort to neutralize the new threat, the Germans decided to focus their efforts on coordinated ambushes, using the terrain, smoke, and multiple 88mm guns in a concentrated effort to overwhelm the Jumbo Sherman. They understood that this was a fight for survival, not just a battle of tanks. If the Jumbo was allowed to keep advancing, it could tip the balance of the entire front in favor of the Allies. But no matter what tactics they tried, the Jumbo Sherman's massive frontal armor continued to turn their best efforts into futile attempts. The reality that the Jumbo was effectively invulnerable to their heavy artillery was setting in with increasing clarity, and it was pushing German officers to the edge of madness. Richter's crew was not alone in their frustration. Across the battlefield, from the dense woods of the Ardennes to the open fields near Bastogne, German 88mm gunners were facing the same psychological toll. As they fired round after round at the Jumbo Sherman, only to watch their shots deflect, they began to doubt everything they had been taught. Was their training wrong? Was their intelligence outdated? Was the 88mm no longer the unstoppable force it once was? At one point, in a moment of utter disbelief, a gunner from another crew exclaimed, "This can't be! There's no way it survived." Another crew member, equally shaken, muttered, "What is wrong with our guns?" Richter himself began to feel a creeping sense of dread. The 88mm Pak 43 had always been the ultimate solution to any problem. Now it was powerless. He realized, as he glanced around at his crew, that there were no answers. He had no solutions left. For the Americans, however, things were different. The Jumbo Sherman had transformed from a simple tank into a symbol of resilience. His crews, too, had witnessed the dramatic change in the battle. When the Jumbo first entered combat, it was an unknown quantity, something new, something special. But now, as it continued to absorb fire and push forward, the tank became more than just a weapon. It became a psychological weapon, one that boosted the morale of the American soldiers while diminishing the Germans' will to fight. Every time a Jumbo advanced through the smoke and rubble, it sent a clear message to the German forces. The Allies were no longer the underdogs. They had found a way to match German technology head-to-head, and that realization was shaking the very core of German tactical superiority. American tankers, emboldened by the success of the Jumbo, began to push forward more aggressively. They used the tanks as rallying points, drawing in infantry for support. The Jumbo's armor allowed them to stand their ground in places where other tanks would have been destroyed. It wasn't just a tank, it was a mobile fortress. Richter and his crew, in contrast, found themselves in a position they had never encountered. They were now the ones on the defensive. The Jumbo Sherman had become the spearhead of American assaults, and German forces, struggling to adapt, were falling back in confusion. By January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge was losing its steam for the Germans. With each passing day, their forces were pushed back, unable to sustain the momentum of their offensive. The Jumbo Sherman had not just slowed the German advance, it had shattered their psychological edge. German commanders, realizing they could not win this war of attrition, began considering their next move. In the face of failure, many German officers resorted to desperation. They decided that rather than fighting this new, unbeatable force head-on, they would bypass the Jumbo Sherman and focus on easier targets. The problem, however, was that the Jumbo was never alone. Even when it was outnumbered, It had the support of additional Sherman tanks, infantry, and artillery that were all now moving in unison. By now, the Germans had begun to believe that the Jumbo Sherman was untouchable. The fact that a single tank could absorb so much punishment and still fight back was something they had never accounted for. Even the fearsome Tiger and Panther tanks, with their formidable armor and firepower, could not stand against the Jumbo's resilience. As the Allies continued their advance through the Ardennes, the Germans were forced to retreat. The Jumbo Sherman had held the line, allowed the Americans to regroup, and turned the tide of the battle. The German forces, broken and confused, had lost their will to fight back with the same intensity they had brought earlier in the war. Richter and his crew, once so confident in their weapon, were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered morale. The battle outside Kringelt had cost them more than just tanks. It had cost them their sense of certainty. The last remaining Jumbo Shermans continued to move forward, relentless, unstoppable. The psychological impact of their survival, of the deflection of the 88mm, had changed the very nature of the battle. And as German forces continued to retreat, the Jumbo Sherman became a symbol of American industrial power and military ingenuity. By the early days of January 1945, the atmosphere on the battlefield had changed. The harsh winter air seemed even colder, a biting wind cutting through the trees as the battle lines shifted once again. For the Germans, the M4A3E2 Jumbo Sherman had become a symbol of their growing failure, a symbol they couldn't ignore even if they tried. The American advance had stalled at key points, but the Jumbo Sherman remained at the forefront of every assault, absorbing everything the Germans threw at it. And with each attack, it became more and more apparent that the German forces couldn't defeat it. Even their best weapons, the 88mm Pak-43, could no longer guarantee success. In the thick fog of war, however, it wasn't just the Jumbo Sherman's durability that was having an impact. The very idea of the tank, the fact that it could survive so much punishment and still remain a threat, was shaking the Germans' strategic resolve. It wasn't just a mechanical failure on their part. It was a crisis of belief. Richter stood at the front of his command post, watching as a column of Jumbo Shermans led by American infantry pushed forward. The ground was littered with the wreckage of tanks and artillery, the aftermath of days of brutal fighting. The Germans had hoped to seize key positions, to disrupt the Allied offensive. Instead, they had been forced to retreat. The more Richter observed the advancing American tanks, the more he understood the futility of resistance. The Jumbo Sherman had proven that the Germans couldn't rely on their traditional tactics anymore. The psychological weight of this truth was heavy, so heavy that it made Richter's chest feel tight. He was no longer thinking in terms of battlefield tactics, he was thinking about survival. At high command, the realization had begun to settle in. The M4A3E2 wasn't just another tank. It was a symbol of American industrial capability and innovative thinking. The Germans had always prided themselves on their technological superiority. But now, in the face of the Jumbo Sherman, it was clear that the Allies had surpassed them. The American military had outpaced their expectations, and this tank, this one tank, had become a massive psychological weapon. In private, many German officers began to wonder if they could ever recover from this. The reports from the front lines were filled with confusion and disbelief. The Jumbo Sherman was not just a technical challenge. It was a moral blow. To face such a tank, time and time again, and know that their weapons couldn't stop it, left a deep scar on the Germans' fighting spirit. As the Germans withdrew, the Allies gained ground. The psychological power of the Jumbo Sherman was becoming evident in more than just the tank battles. It was influencing the larger dynamics of the war. The American forces, bolstered by the success of their jumbos, pushed forward relentlessly. The Sherman's role in this was crucial. Its armor, thick enough to withstand the 88mm's most powerful shots, was providing the tactical edge the Allies needed to sustain their offensive. The Jumbo Sherman had turned into something more than just a tank. It had become the spearhead of a new American strategy, one where resilience and firepower went hand in hand. In the battle for Bastogne, where American forces had initially been pinned down by German artillery and anti-tank guns, the Jumbo Sherman played a pivotal role in holding the line. The sight of these tanks charging forward, taking hits but never faltering, became a symbol of the American resolve to fight on, no matter the odds. By mid-January, the Germans' hope of a decisive victory had been utterly crushed. Despite several desperate attempts to halt the Allied advance, their lines were crumbling. In the face of the M4A3E2 Jumbo Sherman, the Germans had no choice but to retreat. Their previously unshakable confidence had dissolved. Their most formidable weapons had failed. And now they were paying the price. For Richter, the battle was over, not because they had lost, but because they had never stood a chance. The Jumbo Sherman's presence on the battlefield had made it clear that their reliance on a few superior weapons was no longer enough. The game had changed. The Germans had one last hope. They believed that by regrouping their forces and focusing their efforts on the remaining heavy tanks, like the Tiger and Panther, they could slow the Americans down. But even these formidable machines couldn't stand up to the Jumbo Sherman in direct combat. As the Jumbo Shermans continued to advance, the Germans made a last-ditch effort to break through. They launched one final counterattack, but it was futile. A Tiger tank tried to engage a Jumbo Sherman from the front, but the 88 mm's shell glanced off the thick, glassy plate. The Jumbo didn't even hesitate. It pushed forward, its turret turning slowly but methodically to aim at the German tank. With one shot, the Jumbo Sherman disabled the Tiger. The tank's crew bailed out, realizing they couldn't win this battle. They were no longer fighting an enemy they could easily defeat. They were fighting a tank that had redefined the battlefield. As the last of the Jumbo Shermans tore through the German defenses, the final remnants of their hopes shattered. The psychological damage was evident as German forces began their retreat. Even as the ground became littered with the wreckage of both sides, the reality was clear. This war was no longer winnable for Germany. The Jumbo Sherman had done more than just take hits. It had demonstrated to the German forces that American industry, when focused, could produce armor that could stand up to the best the Germans had. Richter, along with the remnants of his crew, watched the American tanks advance, leaving destruction in their wake. The fog of war had lifted, but for the Germans, the battle was already lost. As the M4A3E2 Jumbo Sherman rolled through the shattered German defenses, the cold winter winds of the Ardennes seemed to whisper the final notes of a war that had long been defined by power, firepower, and tactics. The German forces, broken and confused, had already begun to retreat, their once proud military might crumbling under the relentless assault of Allied ingenuity and industry. Richter, the commander who had once been so certain of victory, now found himself on the retreat, watching from the rear as the Jumbo Sherman advanced further into German territory. The emotional toll of facing a tank that defied everything they had known about warfare was immense. But more than just a technological marvel, the Jumbo Sherman had represented something much greater: the strength of American resolve and the relentless drive of a nation's industrial power. As the months passed, the Jumbo Sherman would become a symbol, an emblem of American perseverance and adaptability. Its ability to withstand heavy fire and continue fighting would go on to inspire future tank designs, from the M26 Pershing to the tanks of the Cold War era. It was not the tank that won the war, but it was the one that changed the course of the battle. For the German forces, the Jumbo Sherman marked the beginning of the end. The tank embodied the shift in warfare, where technological innovation and industrial might could tip the scales of victory. In the bitter cold of the Ardennes, as the final battles raged on, the Jumbo Sherman stood tall as a symbol of how technology and resilience could change the future of warfare. The Jumbo Sherman's legacy was felt long after the war ended. The impact it had on tank designs, military doctrine, and the psychology of warfare would resonate for decades. It was a clear message. American ingenuity, when tested by fire, could create the unthinkable. A tank that was practically invulnerable and capable of leading the charge. The Jumbo Sherman had not only protected the lives of those who fought inside it, but also set a new standard for the tanks of the future. Its role in the Battle of the Bulge was only the beginning of its impact. As the war came to a close, the Jumbo Sherman was shipped back to the United States. The tanks, having earned their place in history, were repurposed for training and eventually scrapped as new designs emerged. Yet, the memory of their resilience would live on, a testament to the unyielding spirit of those who fought in them. For the men who survived the war and returned home, their experience with the Jumbo Sherman stayed with them. It was more than just a tank. It was a lifeline, a reminder that when the odds seemed impossible, it was innovation and adaptability that made the difference. The Jumbo Sherman had earned its place in history, not just as a tank, but as a symbol of American strength and ingenuity. And as we reflect on the legacy of the Jumbo Sherman, it's clear that the impact of these tanks was far-reaching, not just in military strategy, but in shaping the future of armored warfare. It's a testament to how one vehicle can change the course of a battle, and how innovation can tip the scales in the most unexpected of ways. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into the history of the M4A3E2 Jumbo Sherman and its role in the Battle of the Bulge, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more gripping historical stories. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode, and join us as we continue exploring the untold stories of history's most defining moments. Thank you for watching, and we look forward to sharing more with you soon.